What is up, Slime Pyre? It's your boy, Severed Slime, and today we are going to be ranking Five Nights at Freddy's characters based on how many cigarettes they would smoke in a day. Now, just for continuity's sake, we're going to be presuming everyone is smoking American spirits. There's not really any particular reason for this, it just gives us something to associate them with. It's not really going to make a difference in the end, but, it just gives us something to associate what they're smoking other than just generic cigarette. So let's go over our tiers here on the side. Up the top, we have whole carton, and then right below there, we have half carton. And, I'm aware that these are very unrealistic numbers of cigarettes to be smoking in a day. However, I believe this is more about their character, and, if the possibility were there for them to be able to smoke a whole carton or a half carton in a day, that they would take up that opportunity and they would smoke that much. So it's less about necessarily what they would feasibly do in a day, more so just what they could, or rather what they would hope to be able to do. So below half a carton, we of course have, nice middle of the road, standard amount, pack a day. Below there we have half a pack, and then down there at the bottom we have not even one. So without any extra further ado, let's get right into it. Freddy Fazbear. Now, I'm getting big, suburban dad energy, per se, from Freddy Fazbear. The white New Balances, lawn mowing, short jort wearing, beer bandolier on the grill wearing Freddy Fazbear. So I'm thinking, real typical standard behavior. So I'm thinking real typical standard amount of smoking, middle of the road, pack a day. I'm thinking that seems pretty fair. Like I said, typical suburban dad. That just seems fitting. Now, Bonnie the Bunny. Bonnie the Bunny is he's the typical suburban dad's neighbor who's he's the Dale. He's the Dale Gribble to Freddy Fazbear's Hank Hill. So, going off of that, I think it's not unreasonable at all to presume Bonnie would be smoking half a carton. I feel that's not uncouth or untoward, Bonnie's, clearly more eclectic. He's more, he has a more outrageous personality. He's almost paranoid, you could say. He hates the government. This, it's quite analogous to Dale Gribble as Freddy Fazbear is to Hank Hill. Now, Chica the Chicken. If Freddy is Hank Hill and Bonnie is Dale Gribble, that would of course make Chica the Chicken Boomhauer. On the surface, kind of complicated. You don't really understand what's going on, but she has her life put together extremely well. Not even one. Chica would not touch cigarettes. She thinks she's above it almost, but really, she just wouldn't go there. She's too, per se, I don't really know. She just wouldn't touch him. She's too pure of heart to reach for a good old pack of American spirits. Foxy, however, if Freddy is Hank Hill and Bonnie is Dale Gribble, Foxy would be Bill, of course. His life is really in shambles. I mean, look at him. He's all torn. Even being refurbished as he is, he's all torn and jacked up, and as is typical of Foxy, not only is he Foxy, but he is also a pirate, and pirates, of course, love to smoke. So you have the pirate loving of not necessarily smoking. I probably shouldn't have said smoking, but substance abuse. The pirate's fondness for substance abuse, combined with his already going terribly life. It's no surprise Foxy would go right up there in whole carton. Now, Golden Freddy. Golden Freddy I also believe would not reach for the pack of American spirits. Golden Freddy, I don't think would touch him. He just, he's first. I mean, they're all kids. Obviously, they all have the spirits of children, but Golden Freddy has the spirits of 2 kids, and I believe that Golden Freddy would be too caught up in his rage, his absolute loathing for William Afton, to have the time to put that off his mind to even think to go out and purchase, a pack, much less a carton, of the good old American spirits. So, because of that, I'm going to have to leave Golden Freddy down in not even 1. Now, Endo-01. Endo-01, he cannot get enough. Endo-01, realistically, he would want to go for the whole carton, but realistically, he doesn't have the wherewithal to smoke the whole carton. So I'm going to put Endo-01 right there, half a carton, right next to Bonnie. He would want to. He would want to. So you may think, well, Severed Slime, you said we're going based off of character. So if it's in his character, then why not go in whole carton? Because, like I said, just because he wants to does not necessarily mean that he would allow himself to do so. He would start going for the whole carton, but then he would, look inward and be like, hey, what am I doing with my life? This is self-destructive behavior. I need to show up for my kids on Saturday. If I keep going down this route, I'm gonna wind up like the homeless guy living under the bridge off of Route 32, and I'm not gonna be anyone. So I'm thinking half a carton for him, because he's working on himself, but he's still deep in his self-destructive behaviors. Now, Phone Guy. Once again, Phone Guy would not even touch cigarettes at all. He has to keep his voice nice and sultry and smooth for, his pre-recorded tapes that he makes for all the night guards. So he's going to want to keep his voice in his throat intact so that this, you don't give a so that you don't come up in the office, your first night shift. If he's like, so what you gonna want it? The animatronics here get a little quirky at night. He wants you to be able to understand what he's saying through the grainy, poor phone. Much less, God forbid he has, the hole in his throat, and he's got to, shove the little, wacky, goofy talk box in there so that, he sounds like a robot that I can't even imitate that voice, but, so he wants to keep his voice intact. Would he want to smoke? Probably. He's working the night shift at Freddy Fazbear's. That's not a real great gig. But realistically, he would tell himself no. Now, Toy Freddy. Once again, pretty big, suburban dad vibes off him, except he'd be the kind of suburban dad who would try to relate to his kids more. He would walk up and what's up, fellow kids? How's it going? Youths, and he would try to use modern slang. He'd be the kind of dad you're like, are you rizzing the huzz, son? Are you rizzing them? That's what Toy Freddy would be. So, he would smoke in front of his kids to look cool because he thinks it would make him look cool, which, it's super cool. But really, he wouldn't be able to hack it that much, so Toy Freddy is going at half a pack. Toy Bonnie, however. Toy Bonnie can absolutely huff them down, whole carton. Zero doubt in my mind. Toy Bonnie can absolutely just put him away, without a question. I'm not even gonna really elaborate on that. I just think you could pull it off. Toy Chica, however, Toy Chica is, put bluntly, Toy Chica is like, the prostitute you see hanging out outside a motel. You can tell she's not content with her life. But, she's standing there smoking. She's rather cheap. she's not like the high rate prostitute for rich people. But she's there for any old low life to come and purchase her services for. So she can't help but stand there and just huff and puff at them away all day. So for that reason, she's going up at half a carton. Above Endo 1, below Bonnie, but above Endo 1, half carton. Now, Mangle. Mangle's life very clearly is terrible. She's been ripped apart and put back together, who knows how many times. Obviously, as made evident by her appearance, rather. She is, just a mangle of, parts. I said made evident by her appearance, but obviously, made evident by her name as well. Obviously, her name is Mangle. So, she's just a pile of parts, just being constantly torn and put back together by kids. So, that's a pretty terrible, awful life that she is living. So, clearly she'd be going for that whole carton. Balloon Boy, however, I believe, would be very self-conscious because he's a fat loser. So, Balloon Boy, big, dumb, fat loser with no friends, he's gonna smoke probably a pack a day. It's like he's gonna look in the mirror, he's gonna be upset with what he sees, not because of, he thinks he's intolerable or anything, even though he is, but he's going to look down and see his rotund self, and he's going to smoke mostly for the appetite suppressant. So he's not going to smoke a whole lot, but just enough to make it so he's not very hungry throughout the day, so that he doesn't reach for the food too much. The puppet, however, also not going to touch cigarettes. She is also too preoccupied helping the spirits of the kids, get to the suits to help them inhabit the suits. Also still very caught up with her hatred and loathing for William Afton. So she's not going to be thinking about, oh, I can't wait, to get out for a smoke. I can't wait to go pick up another pack of American spirits. She's too preoccupied. Withered Freddy, however, I am feeling a half carton off of Withered Freddy, even above Toy Chica, perhaps. Not above Bonnie. There you go. Above Toy Chica. Withered Freddy, he's an older suburban dad. His kid is like early to mid-teens. Like his kid's like Roderick from Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Just a real pain, just really doing everything he can to get under his dad's skin. Like so. Still the same thing, white New Balances, but, loaded with grass stains, kind of torn, raggedy jorts, not a beer, probably, actually, yeah, plenty of beers, a grill that's not been cleaned and nearly enough, so, like I said, he's suburban dad, just kind of having a rough go of it right now because he has terrible kids. Half carton. Withered Bonnie, however, he would not smoke very much. He's going to go down in half a pack, mostly because he's too busy doing crack and other hard drugs. He's not going to be thinking too much about, when he can get his next American Spirit or, filterless Pall Mall. He's going to be thinking about where he can go buy a pound of crack, because he's doing it just, as much as you can. I mean, he's a robot, so realistically, he doesn't have to worry about dying from it. But, as much crack, rather, as he can get in his system, he'd be doing. So, crack, heroin, PCP, really any hard drug you can imagine, that would be right up Withered Bonnie's alley. So, smoking is more of a, occasional thing. Like, well, I'm not doing anything right now. I may as well. So, half a pack for Withered Bonnie. Withered Chica, however, once again, she's just having a super rough go of it. Look at her. I mean, she's got the no arms. Her jaw is, hanging halfway off. She's just really got nothing good going on in her life. She's not similar to, the, ill-reputed woman hanging outside the motel as Toy Chica is. But she'd be the kind of woman who stays at that motel and then looks at her and just kind of like throws up in her mouth a little bit, thinking of what she could have become, even though she is still in the state that she is in. So because of that, Withered Chica's going to have to go up in whole carton. Below Mangle, but still up in whole carton nonetheless. Now, Withered Foxy. Withered Foxy, surprisingly, I don't think would smoke very much. I think Withered Foxy has his life put together rather well. I'd say half a pack. He would still do it, socially. If someone offers him one, he's going to take it. He's going to partake. But really, I think he's got his life together pretty well. He's like, you could almost compare him to Bobby Hill. Like that boy ain't right. But at the end of the day, he's still on the straight and narrow. He's holding himself together. Endo 02, unlike Endo 01, I don't think Endo 02 would be so quick to jump at the opportunity to smoke. However, I do think he would still, be, casually, or not necessarily casually, but, routinely, there you go, that's the word I'm looking for, routinely partaking in the smoking, not necessarily because, for an appetite suppressant or because their life is so terrible, but it's just one of those things where, when they were in high school, they were at a party, someone dared him to smoke like 3 in a row, and, that hit from the 3 at once got him, just kind of hooked on it, and now he's just having a bit of trouble kicking that habit. So he's kept up with it. He doesn't really want to that much. He had a really bad stint back in 06 with it, but as time goes on, he's weaned himself lower and lower. It's now to just 1 pack a day. So pack a day for Endo 02. JJ, however, would not. She wouldn't smoke them at all because she would be eating them. She is just too confused. Because of, she doesn't understand the reason. Like, why would you light it and breathe in the smoke? That hurts her throat and it hurts her lungs. That's not cool. So she just eats them. She thinks it'll work the same. But not really though, because you can't properly metabolize everything in it. So really, she's just eating all the cigarettes and the filters too. She's getting all of it. She doesn't understand the appeal of a filterless cigarette because it doesn't have the cool funky orange bit on it, and she just loves that orange. So realistically, I'm gonna have to leave her down at not even 1. Shadow Freddy, however, would heavily partake, not necessarily to the whole carton level, but he would be doing those party tricks where he would like stick 6 in his mouth at once. And then, he would, like, flip them in and out of his mouth. And, he'd have them shoved up his nose. Like, hey, guys, look at this. And then, he'd go outside and he'd throw up everywhere. But then he'd come back in and he would do it again. So, Shadow Freddy, I'm thinking, is going to have to go toward the top. Probably even above Bonnie in half carton. Shadow Bonnie, however, Shadow Bonnie or the long string of letters that I can't quite recall that I believe begins with R. In fact, I know it begins with R. Either way, he wouldn't. Shadow Bonnie, I can't explain it. I'm getting big student resource officer vibes from Bonnie. So I don't think necessarily he'd smoke. I almost feel like he'd be a narc, as not narky vibes he gives off. There's just something about him that's like, if you were in high school walking down the hallway. And, like he saw like a cigarette butt fall out of your pocket because, you like douse it to cool it off and you stuck it in your back pocket so that they wouldn't figure out you were throwing away cigarettes in the school bathroom. Like, you're walking, it fell out of your pocket. He would pick it up and he'd bring that to the office with you. He'd like grab you by the ear and he'd bring you to the front office. Really just make sure that they send you to the principal. And, he's wanting to make sure you get that in-school suspension because he can't tolerate that kind of behavior. So for that, I'm gonna have to put him down at not even 1. At the top of it, I think, because it's crossed his mind. He's felt the temptation, but he thinks he's above it. So top of not even 1. Now, Springtrap. The big problem with Springtrap that we have to think about is he's British. So, you may think, oh, he's British. He's from, he's from England. Well, he ought to love smoking then. He'd be super big on smoking. And in that respect, you'd be right. However, the thing that you'd be forgetting is we're talking about American spirits. And the only thing that Springtrap loves more than ending the lives of children and being British is hating anything patriotic. Obviously, we can just presume this because he's British. So, while in theory he would hate American spirits because he's, yucky, icky British guy, assuming it was pretty much any other cigarette, which I know breaks the lore of presuming American spirits, but anything else, and he would be smoking probably half a carton a day. So I'm going to have to put him up there, fake PNG Springtrap, half a carton. Now, Phantom Freddy. Once again, I'm going to do all the Phantoms at the same time. They can't really feel. They have no reason to be temptation to the allure of smoking a nice smooth draw of an American spirit. So I'm going to have to put them all at not even one. And once again, I know this kind of, you may be asking, well, why even include them at all if they're going to have to all go down there? They have to. They're from Five Nights at Freddy's 3. They're strictly speaking, they are animatronics. Not that phone guy is an animatronic, but he's iconic enough that I figured I'd include him. That said, if any of them would do it, it would be Withered Foxy. I feel as though this is obvious, so I'm gonna move him up to the top of not even one. But that said, they would never do it. Phantom. Oh, I almost messed up again. I did that last time. I called Phantom. Not Phantom. Gosh, I keep doing it. I called Nightmare Bonnie Phantom Bonnie, and I almost had a conniption watching that over. I couldn't believe myself. Nightmare Freddy, however, he would never touch him. Once again, he's a very responsible father. He's not even going to risk, his Freddles receiving any of that secondhand smoke. He's going to make sure that, not only is he not going to smoke, he's not going to let his kids around people who do smoke. Say they're having a barbecue over at Freddy's house, and, say Nightmare Freddy, heads over with the Freddles, because of course he does, because he's a good dad. If Freddy and Bonnie and Withered Freddy, go and they head out for a smoke, I keep wanting to call him Phantom. Nightmare Freddy, he's gonna walk inside with his kids. He's gonna, sit him down. He's gonna grab him some drinks or something. He's gonna be like, hey, go see what Bonnie's kids are up to. Go see what they're doing. And then he's just gonna send the kids away, make sure they're far away from anyone who smoked, because he really wants to keep them safe. Nightmare Bonnie, however, half carton. He's really going in pretty deep on him. He likes to think he restrains himself by not smoking the whole carton. But he thinks that that's just how they typically come. He thinks that most people smoke a whole carton, and so by only smoking half of it, he's restraining himself. Nightmare Freddy has tried to get him to go to interventions. He's tried to talk to him about it. He's tried to wean him off of it. But like I said, Nightmare Bonnie thinks that a whole carton is the norm. So he's just not really having it. Nightmare Chica. She's right in there with Withered Freddy. She's actually, I'm gonna put her up in half a pack. I take that back. She understands. I called him Withered Freddy just now. Nightmare Freddy. I'm so terribly sorry. Nightmare Chica understands Nightmare Freddy's concerns and regards when it comes to smoking. However, she just it's similar. She started in high school. She's been trying to get off of it. It's a habit she just can't quite kick. And he acknowledges her efforts. However, he does still just really wish and push for her to slow down and try to completely wean herself off that habit. Nightmare Foxy, I believe, at one point was on the same level as Nightmare Bonnie. However, one day he saw what it was doing to himself and his friends. He saw what it was doing to Withered Freddy. He saw what it was doing to, Toy Bonnie, and he quit cold turkey. And now he won't go near the stuff. I'm gonna put him right here above Phone Guy. So he didn't want to become what he saw happening to his friends, and so, like I said, he quit cold turkey. Nothing, he's not touching them. End of story for Nightmare Foxy. Plush Trap. Once again, I really don't like or much understand the point of Plush Trap. But that said, he is, in essence, a toddler. He would have the character of, so he would be also confused by the purpose and reasons for smoking it. So he would eat them. He would also just eat the cigarettes. So for that reason, I'm going to put it right there up to JJ. He will, on the other hand, go for the filterless ones. He will, take a nice filterless Pall Mall or Lucky Strike, perhaps, and he'll gobble that down. He doesn't care to have the orange tip on it. He doesn't much care for the allure of that, but he still will, he'll just eat them because he doesn't see the appeal. Nightmare Fredbear. Nightmare Fredbear, similarly to Nightmare Freddy, he was, he's most responsible of the bunch. He's gonna, try to get Nightmare Bonnie and Nightmare Chica to these interventions. He tries to wean them off. He sees what they're doing. He's not necessarily gonna try to, make them feel bad for it, like Nightmare Freddy does. Nightmare Freddy, he's gonna be like, hey, think about the kids, man. You do this around the kids, they're gonna see what happens to you. They're gonna breathe in that smoke and they're gonna be affected by it. But Nightmare Freddy, Nightmare Fredbear, he's gonna have a more heart to heart with him. He's gonna try to. He's not gonna make him feel bad about it per se. He's more caring and empathetic in that way. Nightmare, on the other hand, whole carton. I don't really know that I need to explain myself on this one. I mean, he just, like I say, similarly to, Shadow Freddy doing the party tricks where he stuffs them all in his mouth, except, Nightmare is just going to, put a whole pack in his mouth at one time. He's going to put them in his mouth. He's going to have multiple up his nose. He's even going to stick them in his ears. And, somehow they're all going to reach his lungs. You don't know quite how he's doing it. But he's sucking the smoke from each one of those cigarettes all the way down to his lungs, holding it there for a long time before, letting that puff out. So, whole carton. Jacko Bonnie, however. Jacko Bonnie, I'm thinking, probably, frankly, pack a day. I can't really explain what it is, but there's something about him that also breathes suburban dad to me. Similarly to just regular standard Freddy, he's responsible, rather clean white New Balance, jorts wearing, burger grilling, beer drinking, relatively responsible suburban dad. Jacko Chica, on the other hand, well, I shouldn't really say on the other hand, should say on the same hand, she's gonna go also pack a day. She's like the, somewhat distant spouse of Jacko Bonnie. They're not too close anymore as much as they used to be. They were real close. They were high school sweethearts. They got married, in their sophomore year of college. They were only 20 years old. And they've been together, 15, 20 years. And they're not as close as they used to be. But, they hold it together because at the end of the day, they still love each other. But, to hold it together, they got to hold on to some of these destructive habits like smoking. So, pack a day. They limit themselves. But still. Nightmarione. Nightmarione, once again, she would think that she's above that. If she's, I have no idea what Nightmarione is supposed to be. Nightmarione would think that they're above smoking. So they wouldn't even touch them. They're gonna just leave those, at the side. Nightmare Mangle, on the other hand, real easy, another shoe-in for whole car, and even above regular Mangle, because not only do they have the history of being torn apart and put back together again, endlessly by kids and becoming this Mangle of scraps and parts. But also, they look like that. They're already, would have been a nightmarish hell spawn to begin with, and now they're forced to inhabit that body. Lastly, and once again, most certainly least, Nightmare Balloon Boy would never even once touch cigarettes. He would, just so as JJ, just eat them. And with that, I am thinking that's going to do it for the rankings. As always, if you think I was really wrong, you feel like you got to correct me on something, make sure to let me know. And furthermore, if you think I was really, right on, spot on with it, you can feel free to let me know that as well. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.